time. And we're looking for an enjoyable evening. We are recording the program, and then we'll be posting that link for those who couldn't catch it or had other obligations this evening, or we're having technical difficulties. I want to recognize our board members, Marge Kachunas, Randy Wilson, Sarah Meadows, Rachel Diver Williams, Shauna, help me with your name again, Steigerwald, and Debbie Grant as well. And we also have a few of our Master Gardener volunteers who I know have chimed in, Linda Mull and Karen Dillon. We thank them. All of these people are volunteers that are instrumental in keeping Bulls Run Nature Sanctuary and Arboretum a hidden jewel here in Middletown. We are looking for a few new board members. Mainly we have 2 vacancies that need filling. Marge is filling in as treasurer, and Sarah is our acting secretary, but we would like to fill those positions as soon as possible. If you would be so kind as to hit your own mute button. If not, Randy will take care of that so that we can move along as we get to the actual part of the presentation, or anytime during this evening. If you have any questions or comments, if you would please put them into the chat, which is found at the bottom of your screen, and we'll take care of things later. But I would like to recap some of the things that have been going on at the Arboretum in this unusual year of 2021. We have seen an increase in visitors since we still have the COVID restrictions that have limited indoor gatherings. So people have moved outdoors and have discovered Bulls Run's trails. We've seen an increased number of cars in the parking lot, and unfortunately an increase in the amount of trash that's left in the parking lot. So we thank everyone who has made the extra effort to pick up the trash and actually get it into the trash receptacles. With the resignation of Stephanie McCabe as naturalist at the beginning of the year, board members and volunteers have worked hard to keep things moving at the Arboretum. We still had the winter tree identification class in January and a maple sugaring walk and tasting held in January, both thanks to Sarah Meadows, our former naturalist. Wildflower enthusiasts could choose from any of 5 different guided spring season walks. Sarah or I led it. I guess I should introduce myself. I'm Nancy Clark, president of the board. And then Sarah and her father, Tom Bergman, led the prairie walk with a whole different set of flowers in August. The rain garden is in its 2nd growing season and it's thriving. Spring Nature Tots met on Mondays. I was able to rework my schedule to be able to do that, to explore the wonders of the forest awakening for that new season. A special program on the 17-year cicadas brought renewed meaning to this unusual occasion. For those who just love Bulls Run or needed extra credit or in service hours, there were work days in the spring. We're in the middle of them for the fall. We've been clearing invasive plants, spreading mulch on the trails, picking up the trash, planting trees, and we will be collecting seeds in the beginning of November in the prairie. All of the many hours are very much appreciated. Our many volunteers, some of them come from Miami University, some of them come from the Ohio Extension's Master Gardener program, and we can't thank them enough for their contribution of time and manpower. Summer Nature Tots did not materialize since we didn't have a naturalist to lead it, but now we do have a naturalist. Caedyn Skiff joined us October 1st, and she will be leading Fall Nature Tots beginning next Thursday. We'll meet her later. In June, I'm sorry to say, we lost our treasurer, Forrest Grant. He'd only been with us on the board for a little less than a year, but he's been a long time volunteer. And he succumbed to a fast-growing cancer. We thank you for the numerous donations that have been made in his memory, and there are plans in the works to plant a tree in his memory. Okay, so as I mentioned, we have our new naturalist, so I'm going to let Sarah introduce her. And if you want to change your view to speaker view, that might, as opposed to gallery, that will also help.
Thank you, Nancy. I apologize to everyone that you can't see me, but I am happy to introduce Caedyn Skiff as our new naturalist. She has a degree in environmental science with a minor in biology from Northern Kentucky University, and she has a lot of varied experience that will make her an asset to Bulls Run as a naturalist. She has a lot of experience with animal husbandry and using animals in education programs through the Louisville and Cincinnati zoos, some experience at Second Chances Wildlife Center, Broadbent Wildlife Sanctuary. And while we don't have animals to care for, we teach about animals often. And so her experience will help guide her in teaching our nature talks and guests about the wonderful animals that we have at Bulls Run. She also has experience with environmental stewardship through the NKU Center for Environmental Restoration and the Horticulture Department at the Cincinnati Zoo. And she has education experience developing new curriculum, environmental curriculum, and leading public and school programs as an AmeriCorps member through the Cincinnati Zoo as well. With all that being said, we're happy to welcome her. And Caedyn, if you would like to introduce yourself and tell us what are you most excited about, and what are some of your plans moving forward to offer?
Yeah, that was honestly a great intro. I don't think I can add anything to that. But I am really excited to join Bulls Run and to help do what I can to keep it looking as amazing as it does, and to provide opportunities for people to come and connect with nature there in all of the beautiful areas that we have there. I want to do a lot of fun like hikes. I want to, we're supposed to have this beautiful fall, so we'll probably do a fall colors hike and just enjoy all of that. Lead things on learning how to identify trees, both in like summer and winter, because those are very different animals as far as looking at leaves versus looking at bark. And then just some, how to look around for animals and find maybe some herps while you're out there, look for salamanders and things.
That sounds great. And I really can't wait to see what you come up with, because I love that stuff as much as I can tell that you do. So we're excited to have you on board. Thank you, Caedyn. Nancy, I'll turn it back over to you.
Okay, thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Caedyn, as well. Caedyn will be doing the Nature Tots on Thursdays this year because she still is a part-time employee of the Cincinnati Zoo, and she is obligated down there Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. So she will be able to lead Nature Tots on Thursdays, and then our weekend programming as well. So thank you. Randy, I'm going to let you go ahead and introduce our speaker, and I have a feeling that we are going to have a lot of information thrown at us. Again, I want to say that this is being recorded. If you have any questions for Greg, he would like you to type them into the chat, and then so that he can answer those at the end of his presentation. Randy?
So Greg Torres is our speaker tonight. We're very happy to have him. He's a naturalist, a horticulturalist, environmental educator. He works for the Cincinnati Park Board and is also president of Northside Green Space. He's a board member of the preserve at Burnett Woods. He is also the co-host of the Nature Guys podcast, which is very informative. We'll include it as a link afterwards for people to listen to because it's a great resource. And I'll let Greg get to it.
Okay, everybody can hear me? Yeah? All right, I'm not a tech guy, so I might screw some things up. Let me see if I can figure out how to share this screen real quick. That's the next task. Okay, there, and is it up? Okay, all right, I see Nancy mouthing yes. Thank you, Nancy. All right, my name is Greg Torres. I'm a horticulturist, a naturalist, certified interpretive guide. I do a lot of things. Co-host of the Nature Guys podcast, and again, I would definitely check that out because we've got tons of episodes on wildlife that's right in your own backyard. So today, though, I was invited to talk by Randy and Bulls Run to the membership here about planting for pollinators. And so I want to thank you all first. Randy, Nancy, thank you for the invitation. And thanks everybody else for participating in this. I hope you will learn something from it. And there is a lot of information, so I'm going to try to keep it moving, try to keep it active and happy and light. But it does go kind of deep, and so I hope to teach y'all something. That's why I do this. So planting for pollinators. Here we go. All right. Let's see if I can get this out of here. Okay. All right, so here's the overview. We're going to talk about several things. We're going to talk about pollination. I'm sure most people already know what pollination is, so we'll go through that pretty quickly. We'll talk about the local pollinator diversity, because there's a lot of pollinators, and it's good to really talk about or mention what we're talking about. Sometimes people think about honeybees as like the only pollinator. Oh my gosh. Sorry, I'm having a little bit of trouble here. All right. Yeah, there we go. So a lot of people think of honeybees as being the only pollinator, or maybe the other pollinators around here don't get as much play. So we're going to talk about that. What are the pollinators around us? Then we'll jump into how do we attract them, because we want to see them. That's the whole point, is planting for pollinators. So there's different ways to do that. We'll talk about host plants. We'll talk about pollination syndromes. We'll get into flower form diversity and bloom time diversity, which are very important in attracting a number of pollinators to your gardens or your yards. And then we'll talk about the native perennials, the plants that will actually invite these pollinators into your yard. So that being said, here we go. So what is pollination? I love starting this presentation off. So pollination is plant sex, and that's just the best way to get everybody excited about this presentation. So pollination is basically pollen transferring on, which is the male part, onto the stigma, the female part of a flower, enabling fertilization and later on the production of seeds. Most people know this already. There's a whole big diagram there, but it's pretty basic. We don't need to get into it. So what is pollinating the flowers though? This is kind of interesting. So there's really two different factors, right? We've got wind, which a lot of oaks, like in the springtime, you'll see they'll dangle their little catkins. They're bright green. They're usually out before the leaves. Maples, a number of plants will use wind to blow around the pollen, and just kind of haphazardly, the pollen lands on the correct part of the flower and initiates pollination and fertilization of the flower. But on the other hand, there's a number of plants that use a pollinator, a specific animal that moves pollen from one part of the flower, or one flower, to another part of the flower or another flower. And that's pollination. And it's a great system that's been developed over millions of years to basically serve as a symbiotic relationship. The animal is rewarded with a food source, nectar, or in some cases pollen, or in some cases they actually will use the floral oils to attract mates as well. It's kind of like perfume. And on the other hand, the plant will have a higher rate of pollination by cooperating with the insects, passing the pollen about from flower to flower. So it's really a symbiotic relationship. And I have at the bottom little phrase there, it's usually, because there's cheating bees out there, like honeybees, or I'm sorry, bumblebees that will go to the back of a flower, they'll bite in the back of it, and they'll just suck the nectar out, bypassing all the reproductive parts. And those are cheating bees. So otherwise, we've got a nice symbiotic relationship that works for everybody. All right, so why is pollination important? I'm sure, again, everybody's heard why, but about 75% of the world's crops depend on pollinators. And this is the good food. This isn't like chips or popcorn. Well, popcorn, no, corn's windblown. So it's not garbage food, it's good food, the good food that we need. So it all aligns right. The flowers are there, the bees help the flowers, they help us, the plants help us, and it's all this connection that we're all supposed to be a part of. So it's really important that we help pollinators, and pollination is important for us, for our food sources, but also pollination, because of the fruit production later on in the season, provides a lot of the biomass for other wildlife to feed upon. It's not just us in this ecosystem. All the creatures need food, and plants are basically the reservoir for most of the food sources in our ecosystems. So we've heard pollinators are struggling. That's a whole presentation onto itself. There's chemicals, there's diseases, there's climate change, there's habitat loss, but in general, pollinators are struggling. And when they struggle, the knock-on effects is that eventually we struggle. So it's really important to help pollinator health, because currently there's no way to replace them. I've seen in researching this presentation, this machine that somebody invented that's kind of like a helicopter. It's almost like a drone that floats above flowers and with a vacuum sucks up pollen and then goes to the next flower and spits out the pollen onto the flower. I don't know if that's going to work to feed 7 billion humans. So we need to make sure our pollinators are in good health and that this process continues on for our own well-being, as well as the well-being of all other living creatures. So that's why it's important. Here we go, local pollinator diversity. This is where I get into my zone here, because bugs and plants, this is where I like it. So here we go. We're going to return to this question at the top over and over again. Who are the pollinators around here? First, pollinators, we're going to talk about our flies. And you see the scientific order is Diptera or Dipetra, depends on how you pronounce it. I'm not Greek, so I'm going to say Diptera. Di, that first part just means two, and then the Ptera is a suffix that just means wing. Now, all the pollinators that we'll talk about in this presentation will have the suffix Ptera. So they all have something to do. They're descriptions about the animal's wings. And in this case, Diptera means two wings. Flies have two wings. So the whole order of flies, Diptera, just refers back to their wings. So they were probably the first pollinators. They have kind of like a sopping sponge of a mouth that just kind of like sops up whatever they put it on. And so they were accessing a lot of the floral products before like flowers were even real flowers at the time. They're generalist feeders. They just need sugar, which is why they're in your house. They're sopping up, you know, the rotten fruit juices in your, maybe in my house at least, because I'm lazy. But they're generalist feeders, so they go to many different kinds of flowers. They're not specific to one kind of flower, but they definitely prefer small and shallow flowers because their mouth part isn't very big. They need to have like ready access in a shallow flower to the nectar source. So they drink the nectar, but they are not intentionally collecting pollen. And that doesn't mean that pollen won't stick to them, because some pollen is magnetized or is sticky and can actually attract to an insect, but they're not actively trying to collect pollen, all right? They're important to some of our agricultural crops, like carrots, which if you know about carrot flowers, think of like Queen Anne's lace, which is in the same family. It's a flat, little tiny flowers that flies can readily just move around on and suck up whatever nectar they can find. They're also, this is interesting, they're important in pollination in cold situations. For some reason, their threshold for activity is lower than most of the other pollinators. And so in the early spring or alpine climates, they definitely thrive. Or in the Arctic is where the flies really kind of take the floor in pollination. Many of them mimic bees to earn protection, and I'll show some examples of that. And then others, when they're larvae, they're actually insect predators or parasites. And some of these flies, as young, can be beneficial to our own gardens, predating upon insects that may later on eat our plants that we do want. So flies are kind of interesting. I'm trying to convince you of that. as we go to these flies. So here we go. Bee fly, very hard to see because they never land. They very rarely land. They might put their first 2 legs on a flower, but they got that long like proboscis, that mouth part you see. And they use that to access flowers, the nectar of flowers, just like a hummingbird would. So it's a really interesting bee, I'm sorry, a fly, and its wings fly, they beat really fast and it kind of hovers. So it's kind of difficult to see, like I say, and they don't sit still very long. That's the best picture I could get of one. Hoverflies, though, these are pretty neat. And you can see in this pattern here, it looks like a bee. It's got those black and yellow stripes like that. And that's an adaptation called Batesian mimicry, where an insect that's harmless will, or another creature that's harmless, will take on the guise of something that is harmful, like a bee, to garner the protection that that bee would normally have. So in this case, a lot of the flower flies or hoverflies, many of them look very similar to bees. But upon close inspection, you see 2 wings, diptera, but then you also see these big bulging eyes and short antenna. And so all these kind of indicate to you that that's a fly and not a bee. But it takes a little patience to watch them and keep your eye on them. They're very small too, but they're very kind of cute, I think, in a way. These ones are not cute. House flies and tachinid flies. While they're not cute, you can see they're very fuzzy. And so you can see that a lot of pollen would get attracted to them and that they probably are pretty good pollinators. House flies, like in your house, like I was saying earlier, they're just looking to sop up something sugary. And so they're going for nectar when they're not in your house. And so you'll find them on flowers oftentimes. For me, I find it on, what is it? Achillea, if you know that flower, yarrow. They love yarrow. They're all over yarrow because the flowers are very shallow and there's ample nectar for them. Tachinid fly, I don't want to talk about it because it's hideous to me, but there it is. And that's a great pollinating insect that you might see in your garden sometime. So who are the pollinators around here? Round 2, this is beetles, right? Coleoptera. Coleo just means sheath, and ptera, and that P-T-E-R-A just means wing. So it literally means sheath wing, which makes sense for the beetles because there's not many insects that need like a helmet to like get around in life, right? So the beetles, they fly real sloppily and they bang into things all the time and they fall and they just kind of will lay there for half the day. But this all indicates why the flowers that they pollinate are shaped in the way they are. And we'll get into this. So with the flies, the beetles also were one of the first pollinators, predating all of the bees and the butterflies. So beetles were one of the first drivers in flower evolution and becoming from like the development of angiosperms. There's over 340,000 species of beetle in the world. There's 30,000 in North America. I heard one time that God, when he was making like the world, really loved beetles because apparently if you take and pulled out an animal off the planet, one out of like every 4 would be a beetle, which is just mind-blowing to think about. Beetles they've never really adapted to evolving flower shapes. We'll get into some of these other insect orders and you'll see that they actually made crucial changes to their body form to adapt to the flowers as the flowers were adapting as well. But the beetles, they just kind of stayed being beetles and I guess it works for them. They've been around a long time. Beetles probably first ate plant parts and just by eating them, they probably by happenstance pollinated the flower as well. Beetle pollinated flowers are large and bowl-shaped. Think of like magnolias or tulips or lotus flowers. Those are some of the oldest forms of flowers that we have. And they all kind of take on this characteristic shape. And again, because beetles are sloppy, they just have to hit a petal and then they fall into the middle. Once they fall into the middle, they kind of just stay there and maybe eat some pollen, maybe eat some of the flower parts. But their beetle pollinated flowers are usually large enough to accommodate more than one beetle. So not only is the flower food, but it also kind of acts as like a flop house for the beetles. They all congregate there and they do their business, which is handy. I mean, it's all right there. So beetle pollination is very common. You'll see beetles pollinating your flowers even in your own backyard. Most of them are scarab beetles. Most common though in Mediterranean or drier desert climates. This one here is the dogbane beetle. And while it's not necessarily a pollinator, it is a stunning beetle that you'll find on dogbane, which grows around us everywhere. So it's a wonderful beetle, beautiful, beautiful. So we'll get into some soldier beetles. Apparently the original soldier beetle was named, it was red and looked like a British soldier. I mean, the creativity back then was just phenomenal, right? So soldier beetle, there it is. I've seen this a bunch of times. You usually can find it this time of year on goldenrod. I've seen it on milkweed and a number of other plants as well. But I love the coloring of them. Those little dark like spots kind of look like eye spots, but they're not very big. They're quite small beetles. On the right-hand side, we have the longhorn beetles. Everybody, I hope, is alarmed about the Asian longhorn beetle. And if you don't know about that, read up on it because it's a serious threat to basically all the trees around us. But these ones, we do have a number of longhorn beetles that live around us natively. Interestingly, the family name Cerambycidae comes from a Greek myth. There was a goat herder named Cerambus. I find this interesting. His name was Cerambus, and he really made a bunch of nymphs angry. And somehow the gods transformed him into a beetle with long ram horns, which indicates why they're called the longhorn beetles now. This whole order is named after this guy who screwed up. Just great. I love it. Moving on, we've got the checkered beetles. They're very small. I mean, tiny, tiny little things, but they're very brightly colored. Just look closely. Sometimes you can find them. I don't have much to say about them, except that's a beetle you might find on your flowers. The one on the right's kind of neat. This is tumbling flower beetles. Again, very, very small. And when you approach them, if you're not careful, they will tumble. And what they do is they literally just roll off the flower. But more than that, there was some high-speed footage taken of them actually doing this. And as they roll, they kick their legs on one side of their body to keep rolling and keep spinning all the way down. Once they hit the ground, they fall among the leaf litter or the grass, and then they get lost. So it's kind of neat, but that's why they're called tumbling flower beetles, because they tumble off of flowers and they're beetles. The creativity, it's great. Scarabs, most people are familiar with scarabs. They're the like classic Egyptian like beetle that you see on hieroglyphics and stuff like that. We have a number of scarab beetles around here. The bumbleflower beetle is one of them. I've only seen this once and it was hanging out on this pawpaw. Cool beetle. The soft-winged flower beetles, I don't have much to say about them either, but another beetle that you might find on your plants. All these, I'm trying to indicate that beetles are quite important pollinators in our backyards like this. Here's a couple more. Jewel beetles. Everybody's probably heard of the emerald ash borer. That was a jewel beetle that came from another part of the world into our forests and have wiped out all the ash trees. About 30% of our tree canopy is now gone. However, we do have some great jewel beetles native to us, such as this hibiscus jewel beetle, which will like the mallow plants, the swamp mallow, the hairy mallow. If you plant those, you might find this insect. The blister beetles, these are interesting beetles. As young, they actually will eat grasshoppers, and like they'll lay an egg near an egg sac of a bunch of grasshoppers, and once it hatches, the larva will just eat the grasshopper eggs. So you have like this boom and bust where blister beetles and grasshoppers, certain years, you have an influx of blister beetles, but then they die off with no food, so the grasshoppers blow up. It's this real neat balance between them from year to year. I've got a lot more to say about blister beetles. But I'm gonna hold off. They were the inspiration for Spanish fly because there's a blister beetle in Spain that if you ate it would act like a stimulant. We'll just call it that. So who are the pollinators around here? These are good ones, bees. And look at this bee in the middle. I mean, this thing exists around us. Look at the colors on that. It's iridescent, half its body. I mean, imagine being born looking like that. It's awesome. So Hymenoptera. Hymeno just means like membrane, and then again, Ptera means wing. So the bees, not just the bees, but the bees, the wasps, sawflies, and ants are all in the same order, Hymenoptera, which is membrane wings. Now you might question ants, but like just imagine taking a wasp and ripping off its wings. It looks like an ant. Or be nice, add wings to an ant and it looks like a little wasp. If you're thinking male ants have wings, and so that kind of is the connection. The females, as they made the colony and over the millions of years, they've lost their wings to become terrestrial. So they are actually part of the same order as bees. So there's about 4,000 bees in native to North America, or to the United States, more than 90% of them are solitary, which means that they're just out there doing their own job all by themselves, which is crazy. A lot of people don't realize that a lot of our native bees are just doing it by themselves. They are definitely considered the most important pollinators, and there's a number of reasons why. One of them is that bees practice something called flower constancy. Now, what that means is that you won't see, if you've got a garden with like all these different kinds of flowers, the bee doesn't just go from one flower to another and mix it all up. The bee sticks to one type of flower at a time. And so you'll see this, pay attention to bees, and they'll move from like this flower to this flower, but it's always the same type of flower until they foraged all the resources from that set of flowers, then they move on to another set. So practicing flower constancy is really important because in pollination, it means that this bee is taking pollen directly from this flower and its next move is to another flower of the same species. Whereas if it weren't like that, who knows where the pollen would end up. So it's very important. Another aspect of it is that they're the one pollinator that's actively and intentionally collecting pollen for their own uses. All the other pollinators are doing it by accident, or they're not even interested in pollen. They just want the nectar. But the bees are actually interested in collecting the pollen. And they actually have adaptations. Corbiculae is the scientific word for it. But it's these modified hairs and indentations on their legs or on their abdomen where they're sometimes called pollen baskets, where they collect pollen and then cart it off to their nest. It's always female bees that are doing this. What can I say? Y'all work hard. The male bees are just there for sex and they fertilize the female and then they die like 5 seconds later. It's mind-blowing life. But the females are the hard workers. They're the ones doing most of the pollination, the rearing of young. And when you think about bees or when you're seeing bees, good chances it's going to be a female bee doing all that work. So the names of bees, and I told my mom this and she never put it together, but the names of bees relate to what they do, right? It's like bumblebees, bumble, honeybees make honey, mining bees, mine, leafcutter bees, cut leaves, carpenter bees, drill holes. So like all the names of the bees kind of correlate to some kind of behavior that they actually do. So let's get into some. I've got some things to say about all of these, but mason bees are pretty neat. They gather up pollen and nectar. I'm going to talk about these solitary bees in a general sense for a second. What are they doing, right? They're going out, they're gathering pollen and they're gathering nectar. They take it back to a nest. In a lot of cases, their nest is just a tube and they seal off different segments of the tube. But what they're doing with the pollen and nectar is they're putting it together and they're making something called bee bread, which is just this little ball of nectar, which is liquid, and the pollen, which is solid, and they form it together like a dough, and they put it in the back of the nest in one of the cells, and then they lay an egg on it. And then however they seal up that cell, if you're a mason bee, you do it with like mud or dirt. If you're a leafcutter bee, you're doing it with leaves. But they seal off a cell, then they go out and gather more nectar and pollen, make another loaf, lay another egg, seal that cell off, and then do this sequentially through the whole tube until it's full. Females are always laid in the back, males up front, because the males are disposable in case a bird finds the nest. So in the case of mason bees, they'll be using dirt or mud or clay. Leafcutter bees, awesome insect. Look at this little female, she's so cute. She's out there cutting, like I get a lot of questions. What's cutting holes into my leaves, like these circular holes? It's this, it's a female bee trying to raise her young. So if you turn to the herbicide or the pesticides to kill this, look at this, cute, shame on you. So anyhow, these leafcutter bees are very interesting. When they go out, they know when they leave the nest, what shape of cut they need to make in the leaf. The round cuts are the seal, that's what seals off the cell. If you see cuts that are D-shaped, they use the D-shaped leaves to kind of line the exterior of the cell itself. So they leave the nest knowing what shape they need to cut next, because that's the next step in their nest building, which to me, thinking about these insects that are moving through our ecosystem with actual intention is kind of really illuminating to me. It's great. Mining bees, imagine what they do. They mine holes in the ground and that's where they put their nest. Squash bees. These are interesting because they require squash or something in that family. And it's kind of interesting. Sometimes you can actually find them in the flowers in the morning time, because squash flowers only last a day. By the morning, they're all limp and folded over. And you might hear in the morning a bee inside there stuck. It's probably a male bee that was just kind of hanging around waiting for a female bee and fell asleep in the flower and couldn't get out and got stuck in there. He'll chew his way out later in the day, but you can always find these bees. They look kind of very distinct, and you'll find them in squash, the squash flowers specifically. Bumblebees, I don't need to say too much about them. They're great insects. These two bees, sweat bees and bumblebees, do live in small groups together. And so sometimes it's only like a dozen or 2 dozen, but bumblebees and sweat bees will live in groups. The bumblebees can be distinguished between carpenter bees, how they say it, because the carpenter bees have a shiny hiney, which means that it's glossy, whereas the bumblebees will have fuzzy butts. Fuzzy butts. The sweat bees, they're the ones that always get on your skin trying to drink the sweat. They like that salty flavor. In fact, Helictidae, that helict is Latin for salt. So the sweat bees, they're iridescent, usually sometimes orange, sometimes like reddish, green, blue. I think they're like flying gems. They're quite small, but they're beautiful, beautiful insects. And we've got some wasps that, while they're feisty, there they are, and they are pollinating as well. We've got the blue mud dauber, which creates those, it'll gather up a ball of mud and create those little structures and actually go out and hunt insects and push them in there and then lay an egg on top of that for the egg to hatch and eat those insects inside that nest. The blue winged wasp, another stunning insect. Look at the patterning on this with the orange back like that with the yellow spots. Its wings are an iridescent blue, especially in the light. It's quite beautiful. And we'll just talk about a couple ants. The winter ant. I was watching one time witch hazel, and this was in the winter, and wondering, why does this flower, it's showy and it smells quite nice. What would it be trying to attract in the middle of the winter? And when I went up, I actually was taking a picture just of the flower, but later I looked at this picture closer and I can see there's 2 ants hanging out on this witch hazel flower. And this was in winter. So I did some research, and it turns out that there's something called the winter ant that only comes out in cold temperatures, but then estivates or kind of like hibernates for the summertime, which is mind blowing because this flower only comes out in the wintertime. So it's great that this insect is there pollinating and probably eating the nectar, but in happenstance, pollinating the flower as well. And then we have acrobat ants. Sometimes you'll find them like these ones were in dandelions. They're quite small. I'm not really good at defining the differences between ants, but acrobat ants exist and they get on your flowers and they're pollinating and doing a lot of other things. Ants do a tremendous amount of work. All right, so who are the pollinators around here? Moths and butterflies, and I'll just add in skippers too, because it's like a lesser known group of Lepidoptera. Lepidoptera, Lepido means scale and then wing. So literally it means scale wings. If you look at a butterfly wing under a microscope, you'll see that it's just a bunch of scales overlaid. It's not painted, it's just scales, which is incredible to think about. It's that dust you get when you've been handling moths. It's the scales from their wings gets on your fingers. Interestingly about the butterflies and moths, they begin life with chewing mouth parts, right? The caterpillars are eating leaves and that, but then they go through like almost like crazy puberty, right? And they metamorphosize, and then they come out with this highly modified sucking mouth part, this proboscis that curls up and unfurls and goes real deep in the flowers. Just that transformation of a creature's face to that degree is just incredible to me. As adults, they don't walk around very well, very little at all if they can walk. So butterflies and moths, oftentimes they needed something to land on. So you need to think about that when you're developing your flowers, and we'll put this in, we'll talk about this a little bit more. Again, they don't have interest in pollen. They just want the nectar. They want that sweet stuff. Right here, we have a question mark butterfly, which I love the scientific epithet here, interrogationalis, like interrogating, question mark. It's got like this question mark design on the other side of the wings. So some caterpillars, of moths and butterflies, they're generalists. They'll eat a number of plants, but some of them we know, like for example, everybody should know now, the monarch requires something in the Asclepias or milkweed family. So a number of our insects are very highly adapted to very specific plants, and we need to be aware of that when we're using our plants, especially if we want to attract these insects into our yard. So butterflies are active during the day. Moths, they're active at day and night, depends on the moth species. And while they're not the most effective pollinators, they're the most charismatic, right? These creatures are absolutely beautiful, maybe some of the most beautiful in the world, and we want them around, right? And so we can do that with plants. So here's some local pollinators. There's a pipevine swallowtail on the left, getting down. And they use the Dutchman's pipe vine and other plants in the Aristolochiaceae family, the Dutchman's pipe family. So these two are mating, quite beautiful butterflies. And again, if you don't, that flower, Dutchman's pipe, is not very showy. It's not something you'd put normally in your garden. However, I can attest that if you have a couple Dutchman's pipe plants somewhere in your yard, the amount of pipevine swallowtails will dramatically increase. I did this while working at the Civic Garden Center, and I saw within 2 years, probably a 4-fold increase of pipevine swallowtails with 3 plants of Dutchman's pipe. Very cool. On the right here, we have the American snout. I included him just because of his interesting face. That snout, that proboscis he's got, really sticks out funny. So he's really easy to identify when you see it. This butterfly flies down to Mexico, probably about this time of year, which again, this insect is this big, and that it can get enough nectar to make a trip that far is just incredible, incredible. Zebra swallowtail butterfly, another insect that requires a very specific plant, the pawpaw. If you don't have pawpaw, you won't have the zebra swallowtail butterfly. Interestingly about this butterfly is that it will lay 1 egg per plant, because the caterpillars will actually attack each other if they find each other. So it's very difficult to actually find the zebra swallowtail caterpillar. You have to be really observant, but you're never going to find a bunch of them in a group or on one plant. I added the skipper on the side, on the right-hand side, because I'm neglecting skippers in general talking about this, but I did want to include one. They're quite small. They are unlike moths or butterflies. They hold their wings like this and like this, 45-degree angle and 180. And they kind of look like little stealth fighters. And they have a very distinct skippy kind of habit when they fly. This one is feeding off of tall bone set. We've got fall bone set still in bloom right now, but it's a great, great insect as well. You've probably seen some in your life, or other skippers as well. The great spangled fritillary. This is one of our most beautiful and large butterflies. If a lot of people hate violets in the yard, I'm currently letting them take over my entire backyard because I like to see this butterfly around. It's the host plant. Violets are the host plants for the great spangled fritillary. And if you plant this in milkweed in your yard, violets and milkweed in your yard, you're almost guaranteed to see this butterfly come around. Also, we have the blues, the eastern tail blue. These are quite small, and you have to really take a good look and get close to take a good look at them. But if they unfold their wings, you'll see this iridescent blue color, and it's one of the most stunning displays, because normally their wings are quite closed. The blues, a lot of them prefer a plant in the Fabaceae, the legume family of plants. For example, Baptisia hosts the Carner blue butterfly, which is one of the only endangered species of butterflies that we have here in our region of the world. So let's try to support them. Plant some Baptisia. It's a great, beautiful plant. Couple more, the hummingbird hawk moth. Its host plant is the coral honeysuckle. So if you plant coral honeysuckle and Monarda bee balm, you're almost guaranteed to see this insect as well. It's almost identically convergently adapted with hummingbirds. It has a very fast wing beat. Even the tail hairs, or the hairs on the end of its abdomen there, are very reminiscent of the same tail shape that a hummingbird will have. The moth on the right, I've never actually seen, but a friend of mine has told me they've seen it here. So this is the virgin tiger moth, and I've still got my eyes open trying to find this insect, because my Lord, it's gorgeous. 2 others that are kind of rare, but interesting moths nonetheless, and they should be highlighted. We've got the orange patched smoky moth. It requires oaks, and as caterpillars, it'll eat oak leaves and skeletonize them. And then last, we've got this interesting Buck's plume moth, which just has a really unique shape. I mean, what an exquisite insect to have. Usually I see them on the side of my wall outside. They just are perched there, and sometimes they'll stay there all day. But really interesting insects. So lastly, who are the pollinators around here? The birds, right? These are not insects. So there's no Lepidoptera or Coleoptera. It's aves. The order for birds is aves because they're birds. They're not insects. We basically have one around here. In Eastern North America, it's the ruby-throated hummingbird. In other parts of the world, other families of birds may be great pollinators as well. Birds are not so attracted to the smell so much. They like the colors in the ultraviolet patterns, or not ultraviolet, they like the colors that in the shapes that flowers have. They're especially attracted to tubular shaped flowers, like you see this guy here in the picture, pushing his face into a trumpet vine flower. Again, birds seeing colors, so attracted to bright colors, especially hot colors. Now that doesn't mean that they won't be attracted to like purples or blues, but for some reason they definitely tend to go towards the hotter colors. Hummingbirds will migrate for the south. They should have already made their migration by now or been on the way by now because the flowers start to diminish here. Their nectar sources are diminishing here. If you think about what's flowering here now, ironweed, goldenrod, asters, those aren't normal flowers that you would see a hummingbird on. So they've already moved on and they make a great migration down to Mexico as well. Again, an animal this big is stunning as any gem, and it flies all the way to Mexico on a belly full of nectar. It's just incredible. So here it is. On the left, this is a male with that red throat patch there. On the right, I've got the rufous hummingbird, because once in a while, this guy is actually from the western part of the United States. Once in a while, they'll get blown off course, and some lucky people might be able to see this beautiful hummingbird as well. So there that one is. All right, so we got through all that. We got to hustle because I'm running out of some time. So how do we track these? And we're going to discuss several ways: through host plants, understanding pollination syndromes, flower form diversity, and bloom time diversity. We'll go through this pretty quick, though. So host plants. What is a host plant? I'm sure some of you have a pretty good inkling of what it is. It's a plant that hosts an organism, such as an insect, that the insect will either lodge in it or require to eat it or subsist in some way off of that plant. Now there's many, many examples. Here's a few of them. The top caterpillar there is the spicebush swallowtail caterpillar. It requires something in the laurel family. So a spicebush or sassafras. We've got the monarchs, which require milkweeds. We've got the zebra swallowtail, which requires pawpaw. There's great swallowtail, which requires something in the citrus family. So a number of our beautiful butterfly species are directly correlated to a specific plant or group of plants. It's very important if you want these insects to have those plants available to them. Also, some of these plants, they provide nesting sites for the developing young of insects. Like I was saying earlier, some of the bees need a kind of tube-shaped nest. Well, some of our stems, like milkweed, if you cut it open, you'll find that it's tube-shaped. And so if you let milkweed stand through the spring or through the winter into the spring, what you'll find is early in the spring, some bees may be able to use that stem as their nesting site. So again, rear their young from that plant material. So again, it's very important to have these host plants around for us. Most interestingly are something called obligate insects. For example, this one in the lower right, this is the flower is Jacob's ladder, right? Polemonium reptans. It's the only plant that can successfully raise or help raise this one kind of mining bee, Andrena polemoni. If this bee does not get pollen from this specific flower, its embryos won't develop properly. So again, it's very important. If we want this bee to be around, we have to provide the plants that it needs to survive. So that's host plants. So we're going to get into understanding pollination syndromes. This is pretty basic. And as was mentioned earlier, everybody should have access to this PDF presentation later. So you can go and look at this at your own leisure. But basically across the top, you see the types of pollinators. And on the left-hand side, the types of characteristics of flowers that you might want to start adding if you want to attract these pollinators. So for example, if you, for some reason wanting to attract flies to your house, you would need pale or dark brown or purple flowers that smell putrid and that are shallow or trap-like and with no nectar. On the other hand, if you wanted to attract butterflies, you want red, orange, or purple flowers, spicy smells, narrow tube or a landing pad for them to land on, flowers that bloom during the day, and ample nectar that they can access with their long proboscis. So again, take a look at this when you have some time, and you'll be able to kind of plan out different flowers that you can add to your gardens to attract certain insects. We'll go into it a little bit more. So flower form diversity. Mostly I just want to show off some of our native flowers because they're beautiful. We've got trumpet vine, which has that tubular shape, perfect for bees and hummingbirds. Below that is shrub dogwoods, which are great for flies and beetles. Again, asters at the top, which are blooming at this time of year now. Stunning. I've still seen a lot of bees on it, and I've seen some butterflies that are still hanging around on that flower as well. Below that, you have pussy willows, which are full of a lot of pollen, which, as I was mentioning, those early bees, our native bees, need a lot of pollen to get their nest up and running. Up at the top right-hand corner, that's the lady slipper orchid, which has a mind-blowing pollination strategy. That slipper shape actually captures insects. They're attracted to that. I've seen this in person, so it's awesome. But they fly, and like a bee will fly to that yellow spot in the middle, touch it, but then fall into the slipper, the pouch there, and be unable to climb out. It sees the lines in the back of that slipper and follows those lines out. And so the flower basically makes this bee follow this maze and thereby touching all the proper parts to pollinate the plant. So it's beautiful and functional. It's great. At the lower bottom picture here, some of you are probably familiar. This is Dutchman's breeches. You'll never see honeybees on this because they can't access the nectar. You need a strong bee, like a bumblebee, to push apart those petals, but then you need a long-tongued bumblebee to access the nectar that's held at the top of those spikes there. So only long-tongued bumblebees can pollinate our Dutchman's breeches. Or cheating bees that bite in the back and steal the nectar. There's that too. So all this flower forms, here we have on the left, Jack in the Pulpit, pollinated by flies. And as we have talked about already, they're attracted to these maroon colors that kind of stink with these lines. There's no nectar either, so there's Jack in the Pulpit. The button bush in the middle, you can see a skipper on it enjoying nectar right there. And I'll skip purple prairie clover because it's hard to say. But on the right-hand side, we've got obedient plant. You can see all those flowers displayed at once, and bees just go one after another in and out and pollinate that whole plant really well. So here's just another kind of diagram of different forms of flowers. We're not going to talk about them all, but just get you thinking about, oh, okay, so I can plant different kinds of flowers to attract different insects, and the shapes of them actually matter. Yep. So here's a garden I had been working with when I was at the Civic Garden Center. I was the horticulturist there at their botanic garden. And there's this great garden. And I was taking a look at the flower form diversity while making this presentation, thinking about it. So here's this garden with all these different flowers. And you can see that this garden had been laid out with intention, designed around flower form to attract certain pollinators. At the bottom row, you can see a number of flat-faced flowers like asters or rudbeckia that will attract some certain pollinators. And then you have other flower shapes at the top, for example, that have a flat head or a sign or panicle even on the right with the hydrangeas that would attract different pollinators as well. So just when you're looking at a garden and you're designing maybe a pollinator garden, consider these aspects, the flower form diversity. Additionally, there's bloom time diversity. The first garden I ever made all bloomed in June, and then it was green the rest of the year. It was terrible, it was a disaster. So if you really want to add food for these insects throughout the whole season, you got to provide more for them than just that spring flush. So again, the same garden, and here we have the kind of seasonality of the bloom time. The light green are what would be blooming in the spring, the dark yellows in the middle or what was blooming in the later summer, and the perimeter around that, the yellow color is what was blooming in that middle time. So in this way, again, you can kind of identify or start to plan your garden around bloom time diversity by thinking in terms like this. All right, so now we're into the plants, and I'm going to get to it quick. All right, native perennials for pollinators. We got spiderwort. There's no other greater native than something that has Ohioensis in the scientific name. So this belongs here. You can find this in the woods. The flowers bloom in the morning, early in the morning. So when it's still quite cool out. So a lot of our bees, our native bees, go to this flower and try to gather up some nectar, and especially the pollen from this plant. Milkweeds, I've already talked about milkweeds a bunch, but beyond just like the monarch, they are a host to a number of insects. They are an ecosystem unto themselves. And anybody who's grown them, just watching it, you'll see a lot of insects on milkweeds. Golden Alexanders, it's in the same family as fennel or dill. This will give you the black swallowtail butterfly. It's the host plant of that. And it's quite a beautiful flower with about 3 feet high with a yellow flat head of flowers. It's in the larger carrot family, Apiaceae. The violets, I've talked about them already before. I've seen a number of insects go to those flowers. There's a nectar spur that will feed bumblebees and other bees. But in addition, it's the host plant to the great spangled fertility butterfly. And I showed that earlier. Great plant. Love violets. Passion vine, we've got Passiflora lutea and Passiflora incarnata. This is the passion vine that most people will find familiar, and it's quite beautiful. It is a host plant to a number of insects, including the red-banded hair streak, other banded hair streaks, the zebra longwing, which is from where I'm from in Florida, and a number of fritillaries as well. Ironweed, Vernonia, I'm sure a number of people have seen this. Paired up with goldenrods, that gold and purple color in a garden is just fantastic. But it's also the host plant of the American painted lady butterfly. So there's nothing better than good old American butterflies. So let's plant this American plant ironweed, which grows about I've gotten it up to like 12 feet tall. So it's a very structural plant in your garden if you know how to use it right. It's really cool. Bee balm, there's a number of species, a number of varieties too, cultivars as well, but they're all very attractive to insects. Hummingbirds as well, love bee balm. It's in the mint family, so it's got square stems and it's very aromatic. It kind of smells like oregano, but it will eventually, if you plant some of it, it'll stretch out via stolons and kind of spread out like mint. Not quite as crazy, but like mint in that same fashion. So you're gonna have a nice swath in a very short period of time. Mountain mint is in my backyard, and it's one of the best pollinator plants. It blooms from like June all the way till the first frost. And so it's constantly providing little bits of nectar for a lot of these insects. And you can see that the flower head itself is not just one flower, but a number of little tiny flowers. This encourages an insect to have to move from one flower to another, to another, to another, affecting pollination. If an insect was able to fill up on one flower, it would have no need to go to another flower, and thereby it wouldn't pollinate anything. So they offer up a little bit of nectar, encouraging the insect to really have to move around. Sunflowers, indigenous to North America, and there's a number of varieties, and they're great. I've seen some really tall ones, and some crazy horticulturists has put a big flower head like this on like a 3 foot high stem. It looks like an abomination, but it exists, and you could have that in your yard. And a lot of people, when they can't provide like trees for early caterpillars or pollinators, they want sunflowers are a good way to go because you get that height and size, but it's going to be gone by the end of the year. Blanket flower, Gaillardia. This is pretty common. It's pretty accessible in nurseries as well. It's a great pollinator plant also. Goldenrod and asters, this time of year, they are the money maker for anything trying to pollinate right now. They are still flowering, and they're going to be surrounded by insects at this time of year. There's not that much blooming this time of year. So if you really want to support pollinator health, plant some goldenrods, plant some asters. And it's not always Canada goldenrod. There's other goldenrods as well. There's like zigzag goldenrod, which is a lot smaller and will thrive in shady conditions. So there's some variety and some wiggle room with your goldenrods there. And asters are the same way. There's big ones, there's small ones, there's all kinds of asters. So take a look into those. It's a big family of plants. Blazing Star, Liatris, is a great prairie plant, but also a great pollinator early in the season. Penstemon, there's a bunch of penstemons, all different colors, varieties, and they're quite beautiful. Great for bees. The bees love those. Coral honeysuckle, awesome for pollinators like hummingbirds, awesome for, it's the host plant of that hummingbird moth. Cardinal flower, also very attractive to hummingbirds. I think it's hummingbird is the primary pollinator of cardinal flower. The problem with cardinal flower is you need to let it self-seed, because if you start pulling out all the little baby seedlings, eventually that main plant, it'll die off. It's not a true perennial. It'll die back after a few years. So you need that rejuvenation of the young coming up from seed. And it's a great like rain garden plant as well. I saw it for the first time blooming in the wild in New York this past summer, right in the middle of the swamp. It's cool. Royal catchfly, another beautiful bright red. Of course, the hummingbirds will love that one. And Joe Pieweed, this is a late summer bloomer, and it's being cultivated now. There's even one called Little Joe. It's not like 8 feet tall, it's like 4 feet tall. So it's a great pollinator plant. You'll see a number of insects on it also. I want to add some shrubs so we can get some differences in height in that. New Jersey tea is a great one, although your soils will have to be kind of specific for it. I think they like a little bit more acid than we normally have in our region here, but it's a great pollinator plant also. Steeplebush, instead of the Asian spireas that are on almost every landscape, we should be planting our native one. This is a spirea as well, and it's gorgeous. It's got these beautiful pink splays of flowers, and I can see a bee in the back there on it. Lead plant, which should be the replacement for butterfly bush. I know butterfly bush does attract a lot of insects, but it's not a host plant. And some of the cultivars are actually proving to be a little bit invasive. So we can transform into using lead plant or amorpha, which basically has the same shape and characteristic, but is a native plant to our region also. And serviceberry, wonderful plant. If you like birds as well, you should plant serviceberries because they love the berries that come later. I try to get them before the birds do because there's one of the best berries that you can eat, in my opinion. But beautiful white flowers. It's in the rose family, so it looks kind of similar to a wild rose, at least the flower shape does. And really great in the springtime. And beautiful fall color too, reds and oranges, yellowy colors. Two others, here's some trees. Pawpaw, I've already mentioned them several times. It's the host plant for the zebra swallowtail. The American linden has flowers that are actually full of nectar, and the bees just love it. They love basswood or Tilia, American linden. Plant some if you can. Willows, I've talked about that already. You can see this bee here gathering some pollen. Tulip poplars, another great plant that it's in the magnolia family. It's going to be great for beetles. They're going to like to hang out in there and pollinate that plant. These two are very important. Oaks. Now, while I mentioned that they have windborne pollen, oaks they're the host plant for over 500 different kinds of Lepidoptera species. Some of them are the moths that you don't even know what they are. They just flutter around in the grass, but they matter. They're food for something else. And those moths need oftentimes oaks to feed upon. So it's very important that we have oaks around. And if you can afford to put an oak in your yard, put an oak in your yard and let it thrive. You will see more birds and more insects the more oaks you plant, period. It's just a fact. Maples are another great tree that we have around here. Great fall color, and it hosts over 300 different caterpillar species. So keep in mind, we're not always looking just for like flowers and stuff, but some of these tree species also are crucially important to our insect populations here. So with that being said, here's a couple resources. This one, of course, is bringing anything from Doug Tallamy read, because he's great, especially when it comes to talking about insects and the plants. He's an entomologist from the University of Delaware. He's made a number of great books. He actually has a podcast episode on Nature Guys. You should check it out. But his most recent book is strictly about oaks, and it goes season by season, month by month, the process of oaks and the process of the insects and how they use them through the whole year. Lastly, as far as books go, Attracting Native Pollinators. If you want to know more about pollinators, the Xerces Society is where it's at. They're actually doing a lot of research on pollinator health. So take a look at their website or their information in general. Lastly, here's a bunch of online resources. There's, oh my gosh, there's a whole section just for pollination and pollinators on the left. And then I've got added a whole other section just on native plants. In specific, this Ohio Native Plant Sources, which is midway down, if you click on this link, it'll bring up all the native plant nurseries in Ohio, and wherever you may live, you might be able to find one nearby, given this database of of nurseries. So with that being said, my name is Greg Torres. You can email me if you got questions. It's going to be on this this last slide here. I do have a YouTube channel where I make videos on plants usually, or ecology, and I'm co-host of Nature Guys. And I've got a number of other presentations if anybody ever wants to hear anything else. So with that being said, I'm done. I'm going to try to get out of the sharing thing. And did that work? Everybody good?
Thank you, thank you, thank you. That's a lot of information. I'm glad we recorded it and that we will be able to share the link with everyone, because that was a lot of information. Beautiful photographs, and thank you so much. So Greg, if you would take a look at the chats, if anybody has any other questions for Greg, please type them into the chat. It's found at the bottom of your screen.
Give me a second. Let me address some of these questions. The pollen that is windborne. Yes, Nancy, yeah, to everyone, the pollen that is windborne is causing allergies. Yep. Thanks, Randy, for the encouragement to take my time and not to rush. Do we have any bats in Ohio that pollinate flowers? No, we don't. The bats that pollinate flowers are usually in the tropics, though we do have some in the southwest of the United States, and they like cactus flowers and some other flowers like that. But we don't have, our bats are mostly insect eaters. Thanks, Randy, for adding that Nature Guys link there. Are there any other questions? Anything? I'd be happy to help. If not, I'll be happy to stop talking too. Okay.
Well, that was great.
Okay.
We do have a work day coming up this Saturday. The weather report keeps improving. So we will be working at the Arboretums beginning at 9:30 through about 1 o'clock. If you can only give us an hour, we will take whatever time you can give us. Nature Tots will be starting in the fall on Thursdays this year, starting next Thursday at 10 o'clock. If we get an abundance of people, Caedyn has agreed to be able to add in an afternoon session as well. We have been limited on the types of fundraisers that we can do. But we do have one coming up with Light Up Middletown. Begins at Smith Park in the day of Thanksgiving, and it'll go through New Year's Eve. But we have committed to supplying the greeters for the booth as you enter from Thursday, December 9th through the 15th. So we will be looking for people to help. And if you're interested, you can email naturalist@bullsrun.org. But on our website, we will also have a link for that. And I believe we'll put it up on our Facebook page too. I forgot to mention the November workday will be November 6th. And weather permitting, we will be collecting seeds up in the prairie that day.
So there's another question for Greg and here, Nancy.
Okay.
About the disappearance of oaks. Greg, you're muted.
Was it about the disappearance of oaks? Was that it? Yeah, that's the second time I've heard that, like specifically within the last week. And I'm not sure where that's coming from, but I will say this in general, all of our forests, all of our trees, all of our plants, all of our animals, they're all in danger. They might not have met the threshold of being endangered, but given the pressures of climate change, urbanization, and all the other like the biological mixing of what's going on the planet right now, so the invasive species pressure, all of these things are really causing a lot of issues for almost every creature on the planet. So we're living in unprecedented times. Plant as many oaks as you can, and just try to do your part. Nobody knows what's going to shake out. So just do what you can in the areas that you can make progress.
Thank you, Greg. you had put up the Rufus hummingbird. Rachel, is that the one that you had at your feeder last winter or late fall?
Yes. Yeah, that is the kind we had.
So that there was an article in last winter's newsletter about she had kept up her hummingbird feeder, and it was a bird bander from Michigan came down to identify and band it. So we've
Lucky you. It's pretty cool.
Really exciting. We really enjoyed it. We've actually had a hummingbird the last couple of days at the feeder that I think might be a Rufus, but I'm trying to get better pictures.
Oh, cool. That's neat. I'm glad I put him in the presentation.
Does anyone have any other questions for Greg before we conclude this virtual annual meeting? Maybe next year we'll be able to gather again. But we thank you all for your support throughout this unusual year and a half. We're looking forward to Caedyn and what she will be able to contribute to the Arboretum. Please come out and support her as well by attending whatever guided tours she is able to offer. Others of us will be available as well. So without further ado, look for the link that will be, Randy, are you going to email it out or put it on the website, or how are you going to do that?
I will email it out, and we should be able to put it up on the Facebook easily. It'll take us a little bit longer to get it on the website.
Okay.
And I'll send out the PowerPoint to everyone that's here tonight, and to other people that expressed interest as well. And if you are looking for seeds for various things, definitely reach out to us so we can trade seeds and swap seeds between people's yards and get more of these plants growing locally, because it is amazing to see how much the diversity can change in your yard in a short period of time with just some of these plants.
Right.
So
The list that Greg supplied as far as native plants, a number of them we do have at the Arboretum already, and we will be looking into supplementing what we already have with some of the other host species that he mentioned, and hoping that we can do our small part to increase the diversity of not only the plants, but also the pollinators. So thank you again all for sharing your evening with us, and enjoy the fall. Good night.
thank you, Greg.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Greg.
Thanks, Greg.
Thank you.